Okay, so this is one of my favorite topics, and I think it's a really important topic for most people to hear because most people do not get to anywhere near their potential in terms of what they do with their careers. Most people don't. So most attorneys never get to their potential. Most law students never reach their potential. And what's interesting is the people that do reach their potential all do something far different in terms of their mindset than those who do. So I've been studying human potential for probably, I don't know, at least 40 years now. And 40, yeah, for at least 40 years. And I'm going to talk to you today about what I've learned about law firms and who succeeds in law firms and who doesn't, and also in the legal profession. And I'm going to talk to you how to improve your life, whether it's personally or professionally, and what will help you do it. A couple things I just want to bring up real briefly before I go into this webinar. And we will also, by the way, this is a live webinar. After the presentation, I will be taking questions. We'll take a quick break. And this isn't that long of a webinar. You can stick around for questions. That would be a good idea. But one of the things that's important to understand are standards. And when I talk about standards, I'm talking about what exactly do you consider good enough? What do you consider good enough? Do you consider, if you were a law student, do you consider getting average grades good enough? If you're trying to get a job, do you consider getting a job in a certain type of firm good enough? And what is it that you concern? What is it that you consider good enough? And what are your standards? And honestly, the difference between the most successful people and the least successful people are the standards that they have, the standards that they have for what is acceptable for them, what is acceptable for them in their personal relationships and how they're treated, what is acceptable for them in terms of how much money they make, what is acceptable for them in terms of their titles in law firms and where they're working, what is acceptable for them in terms of the type of clients that they bring in, what is acceptable for them in terms of the level of the prestige of the employer that they work in, what is acceptable for them in terms of how they stand out wherever they are. And different people have different standards. And what's also extremely interesting, and I just want to bring this up because it's something that a lot of people may not think about, and I want to tell you a few things in terms of how sort of the world works. And one of the ways the world works is the people that you're around typically you'll go to their standards. If you surround yourself with people that aren't that successful and that's who you associate with, you will probably end up like them. In most cases, that's what happens. If you surround yourself with people that are extremely successful, in most cases, you will end up like them. And because different people, when you're around different people, they will have different standards in terms of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable and what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. One of the things that people take very seriously, and they should, is things like the law school they go to or the college that they go to, how they do in college and law school, and then the firms and the jobs that they get when they come out of those things. And so, why is it important to try to work for the best employer you can? Why is it important to try to go to the best law school you can and do well there? All these things are important because what happens is you are surrounded by people with different standards wherever you go. So if you go to a small law school in some small and not a major market that has people that doesn't have high standards for the people that it admits, and there's just a lot of average people there, your odds of getting out of that mindset of those people and getting out of there are much less than it would be if you were surrounded by people that were very successful and trying very hard. When I went to college, I had no idea about what it took to be a lawyer or to go to a good law school or any of those things. No idea. And the only way I learned about this was by being surrounded by people that were interested in these things and told me about it, told me what you need to do and how you need to compete. And I competed with them. And that's what I did. And the same thing when I was in high school, and the same thing when I got into law firms and started learning about what you need to do to succeed in law firms. I started learning about that. Give me 1 second to fix this thing. So this is what standards are about. And every group has standards, every person has standards, and you don't need to be part of a group to have high standards. You can set yourself apart and say, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to do. And certain people, they write out their goals every single day and what they need to do to achieve them. Athletes do this. The best athletes have the highest expectations for themselves. The best people in every profession have the best and the highest expectations for themselves. So standards are important. And what I'm going to talk about today is it's very interesting. Your income is related to your standards. The how successful you are in your career is related to your standards. Your everything is related to your standards because certain people expect more for themselves than others. And it's just that way. Families have standards. Your family has standards for you. So if you are in an environment right now where you are in not in where there are not high standards for what you're doing, you can get out of that. Of course you can, but you need to have high standards for yourself. And you need to try to surround yourself with people that have the highest standards. And this is what the most successful people do. So it doesn't really matter where you start. It doesn't, what matters is the standards that you ultimately adopt for yourself and for your life and your career. And if you're able to adopt the best standards for your life and career, you're going to be far more successful than if you don't. And you keep raising your standards. You don't settle for what you think is okay. And you don't surround yourself with low people with low standards. You need to really move beyond that. So this is what I'm going to talk to you about today. Now, one of the things I'm going to talk about is it's not exactly pleasant because I've seen so many people fail in their careers and in their lives that have gotten very far and then suddenly they decide that they don't want to have high standards anymore or they're not comfortable being around people with high standards. And so they end up falling back into something that's bad. And I've seen some extreme examples of this. And the first one may blow your mind. It's one that I don't really like to talk about that often because it's someone that I knew personally, but I'm going to talk about it. And it's about an extremely successful attorney that didn't have high standards and fell back onto something. So several years ago, I used to work in an office building in downtown Los Angeles, and I was sitting there, and it was the summer, and two women walked in, and they were barefoot. Their feet were dirty, and obviously that's not normal, and they did not look at all good. And they looked, they had scabs on their faces, meaning they were dirty. Their eyes looked glassed over. Their hair hadn't been combed in a while, and they even didn't smell very good, and they looked pretty distressed and not stable at all. They're just in very bad shape. And they obviously had been living on the streets and using drugs and probably prostituting themselves. I don't know, but maybe. And so they looked very low form of street walking prostitutes, basically. And one of the women I recognized, she'd actually been someone that had been a candidate of BCG and she graduated from Harvard Law School. She'd even had a job teaching there for a year after this. And she got a position through me at one of the top law firms in Los Angeles. And she worked there for less than a year. And then for reasons I had no idea what they were, she ended up leaving very suddenly. And around that time, she was going through a divorce. I didn't know why she left exactly, but it may have had something to do with that. She had bought a little Mercedes when she was there, and that had been repossessed after she left her job at this top firm. And I followed her situation and I only learned about losing her job and her car and everything because her husband had called me looking for her. And he didn't even know where to turn. He couldn't find her and knew that I had gotten her a position. So he called me. And now, this is over a year later, she was sitting in my office and it looked like she was living on the streets. I had no idea what was going on. And the scene of these women it was not a good scene. They did not look good, as I said earlier. It was almost surreal. It was just very unusual what was going on. And I didn't react. I just acted like everything was perfectly normal. I didn't comment on how they looked, and I just wanted to listen to what they had to say. They had apparently found a check on the street and thought it would be a good idea to ask me if I could open a checking account for them in the name of the company and then cash the check for them after they opened the checking account. And they said that they'd been to banks trying to cash the check, and the bank said you have to have an account with his name on it. So that's why they came to me, and they were wanting me to help them cash this check and told me I could figure out how to do it. And I did not act alarmed, but I just explained to them that this was felony and I didn't want to go to prison and be involved in anything like that. So this woman, she had obviously gone to Harvard Law School, and she told me she'd researched the issue and there was nothing illegal about this. And it just was very strange because obviously it's illegal to open bank accounts in the name of other companies. And so I was just very taken back by this whole thing, and I'll tell you a little bit why. Before this, I'd met her for a year or so later, maybe a little bit longer than that. I'd met her for lunch at a very nice restaurant downtown. I took her to a very nice restaurant because she was an exceptional candidate and I wanted to make her feel good. I wanted a setting that matched the caliber of the person I was meeting. Obviously, I wouldn't take her to an inexpensive restaurant. I took her to probably like one of the nicest restaurants downtown. And she, I just to be completely straightforward about this, she was a former model. She turned up looking very good in a beautiful suit, very personable and polished. She stuck out as someone that not just a graduate of an Ivy League law school, but someone that was very polished. And she was so polished and had been such a good student that when she was in her last year of Harvard Law School, they asked her if she would teach some class there. I don't remember exactly what it was with another professor, not her own class, but they asked her if she would teach a class. And so she did. As we ate lunch, I started to get the sense, even though she was very formal at the beginning of the lunch, that she'd had a lot of fun when she was younger. There was a little bit of like hardness in her face. So you could see that she was not necessarily, it was just a little bit of hardness. And so I sensed that she'd probably had a lot of fun when she was younger. And I couldn't necessarily explain that, but I was picking up on it and it was subtle. And so I asked her personal questions about her upbringing and that sort of thing. And she told me that from the time she was 15 till around she was 20, had been pretty wild and had used a lot of cocaine, and there was a lot of drugs in these circles she was in, and she implied, but she didn't say that the models that she worked with, they slept with a lot of people and that sort of thing. And during that time, and that she ended up starting college until she was around 20 and had ended up getting off drugs, and then even led and started an organization to help young girls get off drugs, and had completely changed direction with her life, and had done very okay, like what did well, but not incredibly in college, and not a well-known college, and then had done very poorly on the LSATs. And then she was from, I don't know, special group that might have helped her a little bit, racial group. I don't want to say what it is because you might know where she is, but she believed that she'd been admitted largely because of this work she'd done, where she'd started these organization. The organization had been very successful helping women get off drugs and so forth. So I was a little shocked by this because she appeared to be an incredibly great candidate, and her resume and presentation were flawless. And yet she'd been in this wild scene for 5 years, using cocaine every day and that sort of thing. And now she was a completely different person, which is amazing. So she turned her life around and in a major way, and became very successful and had risen to very great heights from what had happened. And so a few weeks before this happened, there was a graphic designer that had done some work for me, and I'd hired him to do some design, and he was a really nice person. And he called me to give me an update about this woman and kind of what was going on with her. And he told me that she'd been working at the law firm and had started using crystal meth, and had gotten just completely out of control. And when I heard this, it set me back. I couldn't believe it. This was before she walked in. It just didn't seem like it made any sense. And he said he thought she'd probably become overly confident. She got this great job and she started making all this money. And she, after all these years of being essentially, I guess you would say, sober and off drugs, she felt she didn't need to, she could control herself. She'd grown up. She could keep her drug use under control. And now she seemed to believe like she was invincible and could do whatever she wanted. And it was just sad because she'd come so far from where she had been previously as a cocaine addict in her teens to where she was now. And she seemed to believe that she could do just whatever she wanted without any consequences. And this transformation she made to what she was now was obviously, for me, it was shocking and troubling. It was just, this is not the kind of thing I've encountered before. And it was funny, actually, I have encountered almost the exact same thing with another really top candidate. He got a job in a big New York law firm in LA, and then same thing with the crystal meth and burning through money. And he kept fans on his desk to keep himself cool off during the day. It's crazy. But anyway, I couldn't believe that this woman had suddenly gotten herself hooked on crystal meth because she had it by all stretch of the imagination, was ready to have an amazing legal career. She got a job at what I would consider one of the top 2 or 3 job firms in Los Angeles, and then effectively had joined Skid Row on Los Angeles as a drug addict, which isn't easy to do. You have to have some very serious problems to end up like that. It's not most drug addicts, they still at least keep an apartment. But in her situation, it was just very severe. The contrast was just amazing. How could you possibly have been, and I don't know if she was a professor, an instructor, or what it was, but how could you go from where she was to where she was now? And it didn't make a lot of sense. And so the story left after it happened, it really is it was something that I thought about a lot. I don't think about as much anymore. And I kept trying to make sense of it. Like, how could this happen to someone? And it's one of those things that kind of sticks with you. And I have seen a lot of people mess up their lives with drugs, particularly crystal meth and cocaine and even alcohol people get. But this particular experience really stuck with me. And then 6 or 7 years later, I felt like I understood a lot more of what was happening because I thought about this. And then I watched different people then that I had seen in my career get to become very successful. And then after that success, lose it. It's very common for people, and I don't want to say this in a way that upsets anybody, but a lot of times people from working class backgrounds where their parents might have been servers in restaurants or whatever, and they didn't have a lot of those sorts of role models. They will get into decent law schools, and then from there they will get into these top firms, and often the jobs only last a year. They don't stay there very long, and even though they're making all this money, or they quit and they just do nothing. It's just, I see this, by the way, almost every day when I look at resumes. So there's something to what I'm saying. And so what was this woman doing? Like, why would she suddenly go from not having used drugs in 10 years or whatever the number, or 6 years or something? Why would she go from that to using drugs, to losing her respect in society, to living on the streets, to maybe even selling her body? What would happen? And why would that happen? And so there's probably some psychological explanations. Maybe she had some sort of psychological disease or a psychiatric disease. But in reality, what I believe happened is she just could no longer handle success. She had a thermostat that had been set by the time when she was young, up until she was around 20, that made her a certain type of person that she was used to being. Had been used to being at one point someone who had a lot of problems, and she'd grown up in a place where her parents, and she was raised ultimately by a single mother, where they had problems and where their parents had problems, and she told me about it. And she had a thermostat that was set at some point in her early life at a much lower level than she was at. And so when she reached an environment where that was much better than could have ever imagined, she sent herself back there. And I'm going to give you more examples in a minute, but it's very interesting. And so one of my favorite things is finding talented people that have a lot of talent, that have a lot of fire in their belly, that are excited about working, that want to do a better job. I love finding those people and giving them the chance to improve their lives. It's a thing that I enjoy more than anything in my job, when I can find people that want to improve themselves and get better and better, and helping them step into a much better and bigger future can be very rewarding. It's something that I love. And there's not a ton of people like that out there. Most people aren't don't have that passion, but many do. You'd be surprised though how many people are not ready for change, even positive change. And when they're given the opportunity to transform their lives, many aren't ready to accept the responsibilities that may come with it. Because anytime you raise your standards, there's going to be different pressures and different things that people may not anticipate. And so sometimes what happens, it's very common when people are given an incredible opportunity for a better life, they will often, and it's very interesting, they do this in People do this in law firms, people do it in relationships. They do it all the time. They'll sabotage it, find reasons that it won't work, and then they'll end up back in the exact same place that they were before. So, what does that mean? So, it means that if you are used to being in a position where you may not be paid as much as you could be, where the work quality isn't what's demanded isn't as much as it might be in another environment, and where you're doing all these things. And if suddenly someone throws you into an environment where you're expected to perform at a much higher level, many people don't. They will go right back to where they were. And they'll do it because that's what they're comfortable doing. People get comfortable. They get comfortable, and because when they get comfortable, then everything, and they try to do something beyond that, then they don't reach a new level. They're just comfortable doing the thing in a certain way. You may be a senior attorney. So senior attorneys often will have a lot of difficulty getting new positions, especially at really good firms a lot of times. So what does senior attorney mean? It means that you may have 7 or 8 years of experience. And so if 7 or 8 years of experience, you may get comfortable doing work a certain way. And so you may have been at a middle market firm working in certain types of clients that don't have the highest expectations, maybe that they can't pay as much money, they can't afford as many hours, whatever the issue is, but you may be in a position like that. And then if you're in a position like that, then a larger law firm will realize that if we put this person in a position where after their 10 years of experience, they're going to be expected to produce a much higher level of quality and work higher hours and do all these sorts of things. Are they going to be able to rise to that level? And in most cases, the answer that firms have learned from decades of experience is no. Most of the time, people from smaller firms will not rise to the level that the major firms need. They can and they do, but most of the time the answer is no. And so I'm going to tell you someone else about someone I offered a job to. But before I do that, I want to tell you another story that I think is going to give you a little bit more perspective about what I'm talking about. So this is the financial thermostat. And so when I was in college, I had my girlfriend, who was my girlfriend almost all of college. She always had these just really bad financial problems and money problems. And if she received any form of money, she would spend it quickly. And then a short time later, she would need even more money. So she was always didn't have any money. And I once suggested that if she never had enough money, then maybe she should apply for more student loans to get living money to live on. And because you could back then, I don't know if you still can, but you could get a loan, and the loan or different loans, and they would give you spending money. So she did, and she received student loans for spending money for several $1,000s to live on the rest of the semester. I don't know how much it was. It might have been the equivalent of $7,000 or $8,000 now. I don't know what it was, but I thought at that point that her financial problems would be solved. She now had money to live on, so she didn't have to worry about finances. But again, not long after that, she didn't have any money again because she'd gotten the money from these student loan for a semester or whatever it was. And she took all that money and she spent it on hair appointments, massages, clothes, and all these different things. And she spent so much money that she was out of money fairly quickly and could no longer afford to eat. And so years later, she continued just doing the exact same pattern. She'd get money, she'd spend it all, and then she'd ask me for money. She'd ask anybody she knew for money, and the cycle just never changed. And she could never be content. So even if you were to give her thousands of dollars, she'd always find a way to spend it. And this is a chronic type of thing. So this is someone who had set their thermostat almost on a permanent basis to not having any money. That was her identity was not having money for whatever reason. She just didn't want to have any money. And so this is what I mean when I use the word thermostat. So some people are just comfortable being a certain way or expect to be in a certain way. She expected to be in a position where she was not having any money. And it's almost like you unconsciously return to that sort of level over and over again. People have certain things that happen in relationships. Sometimes people will be in a relationship and they can't have a relationship more than a couple months and they're always going to sabotage it after a couple months or find a reason it doesn't work because that's where they're comfortable. People do it with jobs. People will go to a job and consistently, year after year, will move jobs after 6 months or 1 year or whatever. They'll just keep moving jobs because maybe they can't be comfortable being in one job. Maybe they feel like they're held down or I don't know, but they can't do it. And people will do the same thing. The most common example that everyone should be familiar with, it's part of the society, is everyone wants to lose weight. And so people will lose weight. Now, I know it's probably much easier to lose weight now than it used to be because there's all these different drugs and things, but there didn't used to be. And so people would have to lose weight only based on willpower. And so people would lose weight and then it would come off and then they would quickly gain it back. And same thing with money. People make a lot of money and spend it immediately, or people get off drugs and they rebuild their lives and then they return to the same destructive behavior later. I had an awful thing happen with one of my neighbors. It was the same thing with him. He had been a cocaine addict for the longest time. And then 15 years previously, he'd apparently stopped, or 20 years, and had gotten off all this cocaine. And then he ended up developing this habit again and hiding it from his wife and then ended up dying. He had a heart attack or something from it in the middle of the night. And it's horrible. He was maybe 54, 55. And he went back to that pattern. And the same guy was a gambler. Like he'd stopped gambling and then he couldn't, went back to gambling. So people do it with behaviors. They do it with drugs. They do it with alcohol. They do it with relationships. They do it with jobs. People just get into these positions and then they revert back to where they were previously. And it happens. So people have a thermostat and they never can escape that. When they improve, they always go back to where they were before. It's how so many people operate. They reset themselves to a level that is lower than where they should be. And the opposite happens, of course, too. So very successful people, something bad will happen, and maybe they get knocked down a rung or two, or three or four, but then they come back and they come back at a higher level as well. So everyone has these different thermostats. And so your challenge in your career and your life really is to have your thermostat at a higher level, to continually push your thermostat higher and to continually have goals and to realize that where you are today doesn't need to be where you are tomorrow. You need to think high to rise. You need to be someone who believes in yourself. You need to believe in what you can accomplish in your career. And you need to, when you do believe that and you go there, you need to stay there. So if you're used to operating at 50 degrees and you want to operate at 80 degrees, then you need to tell yourself, I'm going to do whatever it takes to operate at 80 degrees and not 50 degrees. And so what do people do that operate at 80 degrees and not 50 degrees? What is it that they're doing differently than people that are operating at a lower level? And so these are like things that you need to be very aware of in your career and life, because anytime you see someone that's more successful than you, and in the legal field, especially in relationships and whatever it is, anytime you see someone that's more successful than you, then you need to look at what they're doing and say, what does their thermostat look like? What does their thermostat look like in terms of the quality of work that they expect out of themselves? What does their thermostat look like for the quality of work they expect out of each other? What does their thermostat look like in terms of the type of clients and business they have? What does their thermostat look like in terms of the hours that they work and all these different things? And so you have to look at that and say, is that something I can do? Some of the most successful attorneys that I know of, and And I know lots of very successful attorneys, but the most successful attorneys that I know of often are people that have started out their careers at smaller firms. And they started out at smaller firms and they said, I'm going to become an even better attorney. I'm going to do even better work than the partners I'm working with and every associate here. And then they do. They become incredibly competent, incredibly valuable, and people in the firm think very highly of them because they've set a very high thermostat for themselves. And then they get to a point and they're like, I belong at a better firm, and they go to interview at a better firm, and the better firm picks up this person's amazing. They're hungry. They're trying to do the best job they possibly can. This is the type of person that we want here. And they bring them in, and often they'll bring them in even though their qualifications aren't as good as other people that they could potentially interview. They'll bring them in because you can pick it up. When you interview and you talk to someone with a lot of enthusiasm, that's going places, that wants to get better, that has very high goals for themselves, that sets goals, that does all these things, and you pick up on that, then you realize that you've got someone that you can channel that drive and energy into profits and to doing a good job for your clients, all these things. And so those people get hired. The people that want to get ahead, and they're obviously trying to get ahead, and they're doing everything they possibly can to get ahead and have high standards for themselves, are the ones that are always hired. So if you say, okay, I'm at this middle market firm in this middle market city. And so middle market firm, all that means is it means that the firm is you may do litigation, but you may do it on behalf of companies with 20 to 30 million dollars or 50 million dollars in revenue, as opposed to doing it with companies that have 500 million to 2 billion in revenue. So you're doing litigation on behalf of smaller companies, and you say, I want to work with the biggest companies and the biggest matters, and the matters are in the paper and the most important litigation around the country. And so you say you want to do that. And so you start thinking in terms of what you need to do to be that sort of person. What do you need to do to be the kind of person that does that sort of work? How do you need to think about things? What are people doing that are at that level? What are they doing differently than what I'm doing? How hungry are they? What are they doing? Because the point is, anybody in the legal profession can do incredibly well. You can become It doesn't matter how well you did in law school. Some of the most successful attorneys were last in their class in law school. I remember Phil Corboy, one of the most successful personal injury attorneys in Chicago history, probably the most successful, was last at law school. Biden was apparently last at Syracuse or Albany. Anyway, but the point is that you don't need to succeed in law school to become successful. You don't need to succeed in your first job to become successful. You don't even need to get a job. I've known people it took them a year to get jobs, and now they're worth tens of millions of dollars doing different types of practice areas because they decided they wanted to do something. One woman I know that's probably the most successful immigration attorney in the country, she was working for a woman after her second year of law school, helping her with immigration petitions. And she saw that this woman was just taking these kind of easy immigration petitions instead of doing these petitions for people with extraordinary abilities, meaning bringing over star athletes and people that are the top of their field and different careers. And she's like, why wouldn't she be doing those? You can make 20, 30, $40,000 doing one of those instead of 3,000 in these small things. She realized that the woman wouldn't do it. So she decided she was going to have high standards for herself and just decided to start her own immigration firm right out of school and became incredibly successful. She has standards. So people that succeed have very high standards for themselves, and you need to too. And you have to raise your thermostat to succeed to a higher level. And then once you're there at that level, you need to figure out what you need to do to keep it there and not let it drift back down. It's so common for attorneys to get into the employers and just never raise their thermostat to the level they're capable of, and to not allow it to drift back down. It happens all the time. People just get into these environments and they don't go up to those standards that they're capable of, or they get into very competitive. This is the other one. So people will get into very competitive legal environments and they'll decide, I want to be in an atmosphere with a lower standard. Imagine that. This is what happens to most attorneys that join the largest law firms in the country. They will get into those law firms and they will be there for a few years and they will say, I want to work in-house at a job doing something else, or I want to work in a job with better hours and all that. And you can certainly do that. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But the people that are successful are the ones that are never lowering their standards. They're always trying to keep higher and higher standards. Now, you may not want to do that. I'm not saying for everyone. You may only want to do it at a small firm. You may want to do it at a large firm. You may want to do it on your own. But the more you expect of yourself, the better you're going to do. I was reading this article. It was very interesting. It was in, I don't know if where the attorney was, but it was for a DUI attorney somewhere out in the Hamptons or something. And it was interesting. It was a profile. I don't know if it was in the Wall Street Journal, but it was something like that. It was in a big important publication. And it was talking about this guy that he would represent anybody that got Hamptons or whatever, represent people that got arrested and put in for drunk driving and things. And he was the person that everyone called, and he charged all this money and was very successful. But what it also said that it was interesting was just how much time, like how available he was. So you could reach him 24 hours a day. He would pick up the phone. He would meet with people. He would do all these things. And I thought that was actually extraordinary because didn't have a particularly awesome pedigree by any stretch of the imagination, but here is someone being profiled in the Wall Street Journal that was all in. You could call him anytime. He was happy to take your call. He would get up in the middle of the night, whatever it took. And so that's an example. Those are standards. And thought that was interesting because I know that most attorneys wouldn't do something like that. And so you had standards, and any practice area you're in, you can have standards. And most people, though, what happens is a lot of people is if they raise their standards and they get someplace, then they'll often always go back to the previous setting. And you have to keep your standards high. You have to keep them high at all times, and you need to do whatever you can to have the highest standards possible. So here's an example. So imagine that you decide to start exercising every morning at 6. The thing that will happen first is your body and your mind will tell you this is crazy, that this is the wrong time for you to exercise. And everything inside of you will resist this. You will decide probably that this is not the right thing to do. And so what'll happen is for the first week, first day, you'll try to find excuses not to get out of bed. Then for the first week, you may start trying to make excuses. And then even after the first several weeks, you'll start looking for excuses. Maybe I can't do it this today. Maybe I'm tired. Maybe I'll not do it this. I was out late. And so you'll keep having these old habits trying to push you back. But then it could take months for your body to adjust, probably not that long, probably a week or two, but your body and mind will finally adjust. And eventually you're going to basically think it's completely normal to get up at 6 a.m. Your body will think that, you'll think that, your psychology will think that, and then this will become the standard of what you're accustomed to. And this will no longer feel extreme, it'll feel routine, and you'll suddenly have new standards for yourself, and you will start getting up every day at 6. I know a woman and her husband that have been doing that for 5 years. They just started doing it. She looks actually fantastic too. She gets up at, I think, 5 a.m. to go to a 5:15 exercise class every day. And that's just very interesting. There was a article I read not too long ago. It was called Still Running After All These Years, and to discuss people that have been running every day for more than 30 years. It's just, I can't even imagine. But there's people out there that have never missed a day, that have run every single day for 30 years. There was a guy in, I think it was Miami or something, that had been doing that, and he'd done it every day for even like 50 years or something. It's just something incredible. But you can develop a habit to do anything, whether it's exercise, whether it's writing. I, for a long time, had a thermostat where I would write at certain times every day and do that. So you can develop all sorts of expectations for yourself, whether it's exercise, whether it's getting better at what you're doing, whether it's doing 30 minutes or an hour of business development each day, whether it's making sure that whatever it is you want to do. Your standards may say, I never bill less than 2,400 hours a year, or whatever it is. You develop standards for yourself, and you don't go back to zero. You keep yourself in higher standards. So It's one standard not to exercise at 6 in the morning every day. It's another standard to do it every day and to have that standard. And if you have that standard, if that's what you do, you're going to be in better health. You're going to look better. You're going to live longer, all those things. So it just wouldn't change into that one standard. So this ability to go running every day is an example. What happens when someone does that is they start off with a decision and they make that decision that this is my new standard. And then that new standard becomes permanent through consistency. Now, I'm not saying that you get up and run every day at 7. I certainly don't. I mean, I have a time I exercise every day, though, and that's non-negotiable. But anytime you make a decision to do something, it's going to become permanent the longer you do it over and over again. And so there are certain things that you can do for your standards in your career and your life that are going to make a major difference. So what is your standard? Do you have a standard that says, I'm going to think about and work on business development as an attorney every day for an hour? I tell this story a lot, but one of the most successful people that bring in business in Los Angeles that I know of, as an associate, he would make sure that he billed 2,000 hours a year. That was non-negotiable. But he would also make sure that he spent 2,000 hours a year working on developing business. He would go out and meet people. He would do all these different things to try to develop business. And then he did. Any attorney that develops business does those sorts of things. They have a standard where they do one thing where most people are going to bill whatever it is, 2,000 hours, and that's it. Or other people will bill 2,000 hours and spend more time developing business. And then they become successful attorneys and they have great careers and lives and make so much money that there's money for their children and their children, all these different things you can do. And all it takes is having standards. It's not really that difficult. It doesn't matter where you went to law school. It doesn't matter how you did there. It matters if you set standards for yourself and goals that you want to achieve, and then what's necessary. Do you have certain standards? I have certain standards for my job. I make sure that I start work at a certain time each day, that I work a certain number of hours, that I do certain things, that I review goals, everything. I have standards, and everyone needs standards, and you need standards, and you need probably higher standards than you have right now. Most people do. And then you also need to realize, think back in the times where you were in a position where you may have sabotaged your standards, because a lot of people do that. And the thing I want you to be most concerned about and think about is, who are you surrounding yourself with? Who are you taking input for on your standards? So you have lots of decisions about who to take input from. You may take input about your standards and what's possible from your family. A lot of very good families have very high standards for their children. They have standards in terms of the type of people that they marry. They have standards in terms of the type of schools they expect their kids to go to. They have standards in terms of the type of professions they expect from them. So think about that. If you're an attorney, the odds are probably pretty good that more than 50-50 that you have a family and people in your family that have some sort of standards for you and what's acceptable. And if you're around a family that doesn't have standards for you, it becomes much harder to get to a higher level, because your parents a lot of times may even sabotage you. They may want you to not have high standards, because if you have high standards, then that's going to separate you from them. And that's going to make them feel like there's something wrong with them. And that's going to remind them of their own lack of success. Now, most parents are not like that, but a lot of them are. So that's one thing. Your friend groups may have standards. Their standards may be good and they may be bad. You may have friends that also don't want to see you succeed and have high standards, because if you do, that's going to eclipse them and make them feel badly about themselves. So you'll sabotage yourself. People sabotage themselves for their families. They sabotage themselves for their friends. I remember my mother was saying something that I found just fascinating one time. She was talking about someone, and it was someone that we both knew, that was extremely smart, just very smart, like 1580 in their SATs, but had not gone to a particularly good college. Their mother was a waitress, and their father never really did much of anything. And anyway, but very smart person, driven, paid for their own college and put themselves through and just very smart. But then she said something that I thought was absolutely very interesting. So he married a woman from a very small town, like a small kind of working class town in Kentucky. And the woman was, I don't think, went to college or anything like that. And he got a job there and to be close to her. And she said something I thought was very interesting. He'll never succeed because of who he chose for a spouse. I, I thought that was really mean at the time, but then I thought about it and I realized that it was true. Like he was living in a small town. He was had to work in a small company. His someone who had been very motivated to do things, it held him back. Whereas imagine if he married some people make different choices. And so I'm not saying that what my mom said was correct. Maybe he was happier doing what he's doing, but there's some truth to that. So standards, the people you go to school with, set standards. I was thinking it was interesting. So I grew up in the city called it was Grosse Pointe, Michigan, and there's a school there. There's two high schools. One of them is Grosse Pointe South. There's Grosse Pointe North, and then I knew a guy from Grosse Pointe South that was smart. I knew him from the time he was young, and he went to Yale and played football there. And he told me that in this Grosse Pointe school, it's not a great school, it's okay, but he said he was the only person to have gone to a school like Yale or Harvard from that school in, I don't know, 15 or 20 years or something crazy like that. And I thought it was interesting because a mile away, there was a very competitive private school called Liggett, and people from that school, even though there's like maybe 60 to 70 kids in a graduating class, probably 5 or 10 of them go to those types of schools, like Ivy League type schools. And it's interesting. But at that other school, which I attended when I was younger, the people are very competitive and high standards, and their parents were the head, went to schools like that. And it's just so the people you're around can set your standards. And sometimes, and there are people that move out of those environments. And he did. He went to Yale, he did well, he went to a good law school, he's at a good law firm in Detroit as an attorney, but he set high standards for himself. And so people that do that succeed. And then the people that keep their high standards do very well. And so you have to ask yourself, like, who am I surrounding myself with? Whose standards am I allowing to control the way I think about my career and life? Like how are the people I'm around pushing me to a higher level, or are they pushing me to a lower level? And what's acceptable for me? And so sometimes if you don't want to be successful or you're afraid of success, you will hide under and around people that don't have high standards. You'll stay in firms where they don't have high standards. You'll move out of firms and into environments where they don't have high standards. One reason, by the way, this is very interesting. And I want to make sure that everyone understands this because what I'm going to talk to you about right now, just briefly, it could change your entire career if you think about this. So law firms are known to each other by the quality of work that they do most of the time. So if you're at one firm, they're going to have a reputation for doing a certain type of work versus another firm. So the very best firms, if you're there for 5 years doing something, the presumption is that you're a pretty good attorney because you're able to stay there for 5 years and you're doing good work. And then you are, because you can't stay at any decent firm for 5 years if you're not doing really good work. So I just want you to think about that. So the better the firm and the longer you're there, the more it says you're probably doing pretty good work. So that's how firms think about each other. So if you're at one of the 100 largest firms in the country and you've been there for a few years and you move to another one, then those firms are going to assume that you're operating with a certain level of standards. And the same goes for if you're at a small law firm. If you're at a small law firm, that doesn't represent decent clients, larger firms are often going to perceive that you may not be operating to the same standards. And they often will know the quality of work that people do at different firms because firms are against each other in litigation and opposite in transactions and all this sort of stuff. So firms really have a very good sense of the type of standards that different employers have. So your objective as an attorney is always going to be to try to have the highest standards you can for yourself, because even if you're at a smaller firm, if someone is talking to you, they're going to have a sense that you have high standards for yourself. And because of that, they're going to be more likely to bring you on often than even people from other top firms. But here's the thing with standards. So law firms understand standards. Law firms understand standards locally, meaning in their market, and then they often have a decent understanding of standards in other markets. But imagine you're trying to move to a major law firm in Chicago and you're in a small law firm in Alabama. The law firm in Chicago is going to be very concerned because they're not going to have any contact with their firm. They're not going to know exactly the standards of that firm. So it's going to be difficult to get hired by that law firm in Chicago or New York or whatever that person's trying to do. All about the perception of what are the standards. So here's the problem, though, that people run into. So when someone goes and they leave a law firm and they go to work in different types of government, now the U.S. Attorney's Office is not necessarily that example, but they go to work for state government, or they go to work in some position in the federal government, or they go to work in house, or they go to work, I don't know, in public interest or whatever it is, then all of a sudden they're putting themselves in these roles where the law firm doesn't, that if they want to work in another law firm, the law firm has absolutely no idea about the type of standards that may be required in that of that employer. There's hundreds of thousands of companies in the United States that attorneys can work at. Law firms have no idea what the standards of those companies are in hiring and the type of work people do. There's tens of thousands of government positions and things. And people don't, then law firms have no idea what those standards are. So they can't possibly, in good conscience, bring people on. And that's exactly what happens. If you go in-house, it becomes extremely difficult. It's not impossible, but to get a job at especially the large firms because they don't know the standard of work that you're doing. They don't know what's required. They don't know if you're required to work 2,000 hours or what it is or the quality of work that's required. No one knows. And so people evaluate you based on the resumed standards. And law schools have standards of the kind of people that they admit, the who you're competing with against to get grades and things. All this stuff is about standards. You need high standards and losing weight, not accepting. I'm not saying anybody ever, no one needs to lose weight. People can, it doesn't really matter. But if that was your goal, then that's, you have to have a certain standard and you have to accept nothing best for yourself. And it's the same thing about managing your money or staying off drugs. People standards. People say it's interesting too, because people, one of the things that people do a lot of is, and I think I'll talk about this in a minute, but they have standards for how much money they want to make. That's one of the big things. And they will, if they're making a certain amount of money, they'll say, that's my standard. That's how much I want to make. But if you're going to accomplish anything in relevant, I mean, in your career and life that you really want to do, if you want to do something, then you have to have a higher standard that you're willing to live by. And you have to only then, after you realize what those standards are, you're going to begin to realize all the possibilities that you have in your life and then in your career by having higher standards. So what can you look at right now? What are you doing in your career that for your standards? Are you making sure that you have the higher standards that you can? And you have to make sure that you have the highest standards possible if you want to do anything. Now, some people don't have any standards. They just want a job. They think that's all they want. But the only people that are getting ahead are those with the high standards. I remember not that long ago meeting a woman who was telling me how difficult her life was. And she was focusing on all the things that were going wrong in her life. And it's very common. I'm sure you meet people like this all the time that will tell you all sorts of negative things. And so this woman with this conversation became a list of complaints. She complained about not having health insurance, which is a problem. She told me that her husband had been unemployed for a long time, which she had every reason to be concerned about. She explained that she'd also been unemployed and hadn't made a lot of money over the past year. She talked about how because of all this unemployment, she couldn't afford to buy a house and that she and her husband didn't live in a great neighborhood. And she described a very strained financial situation. And she explained that the economy wasn't treating her well. And so it was difficult. And that her husband, she were lucky to make a couple $1,000s a month. And so her entire outlook was about limitations and scarcity, meaning not enough. And that's fine, but that's what her outlook was. Everything the way she saw the world and the glasses she was looking through the world were all about limitation and scarcity. And so I got to know this woman fairly well. I had several meetings with her, and I realized that she was very intelligent. She could process things very quickly. She could be, with her mind, very successful and could do very well in a company like mine if she wanted to, with her level of motivation. And so the more I spoke with her and asked deeper questions, the more I began to understand why she was in the position she was. And I'm sure everyone knows people like this. Everyone knows people that complain a lot. Everyone knows people that aren't as successful as they can be. Everyone knows people that have problems with drugs and they can't get away from them, and drugs or alcohol. Everyone knows people like this. And so this woman, I was in her mid 30s, and in her entire career, she'd been doing mainly sales type positions. And in these positions had always been an independent contractor, not an employee for whoever she was working with. And she'd never worked in a job that would require her, for example, to sit behind a desk all day. She was accustomed to constant movement. And so she didn't have, whenever she was working at home and so forth, she didn't have a lot of structure in her routines. I asked her at one point if she'd ever had a full-time job. And she said, and I thought this answer would tell me a lot, if she'd ever operated in a structured environment. And she told me she'd once worked somewhere for 9 months in a full-time job, and that was as an employee, and that was the extent of her experience. And everything else had been independent type contractor and commission-based work. But there's attorneys also that spend their careers doing independent contractor commission type work as well. It's in every profession. And so I sat down with her for about an hour, and I asked her detailed questions about her situation. And after asking her some questions, because she was so smart and motivated, I thought that I might have something for her to do, that I could find a position for her possibly working for me, and something that paid a decent salary, much more than this kind of piecemeal income she was making, that would provide structure that hopefully could make her successful, that would give her health insurance and give her this, offer her stability she didn't have. And she even told me that her children hadn't been to the doctor in a long time. And so I felt that I had the ability. I felt very good about myself, that if she did what I could have her do, I could help her change the circumstances of her family and her life. And but the only catch was that she'd have to do this work over the phone, not moving around, and just adjust that. But it seemed like a no-brainer. She was getting what she said she wanted and didn't have. And I figured that maybe she'd just been unlucky. I didn't think through it in the way I should have. As I discussed making her an offer, and I could see she was hesitant. And I see this a lot when I talk about people working for me. If I start telling them what the job requires and things, you can see it on their face. And in her case, she began finding reasons why I couldn't work, and not related to the job. Instead of there were objections about commuting, there were excuses why the job couldn't be done. And so the more I spoke to her, I started realizing what was happening. She wanted to be someone that was wandering around, not sitting at a desk all day. She didn't want structure, that stability of a job that had structure, and was foreign to her. It's not something she wanted. And the life that she'd been living with all this stuff was familiar, and it was what she knew. And she literally, this is hard to believe, but she seemed that she wanted to be in this position where she was complaining all the time about all these things, that things were bad, that things were negative, where they stayed negative. And so I realized that even if, with all these excuses and all these reasons why things were difficult and all this stuff about maybe not wanting to work at a desk and working, she seemed someone that would set herself back to that level. So someone who'd want to go back to what she experienced before and what she was, because that was what she was comfortable doing. And it's very interesting. People are like that. And all the time I hire people or I get place people, and they end up back where they were, and they do it intentionally. Or maybe they don't do it intentionally. Maybe it's subconscious or something like that. But people end up back where they were before because they're used to that. So you have to be very aware of what you expect of yourself. You have to have very high goals for yourself, and you have to not let people intimidate you or push you in the other direction. And every employer, by the way, every employer, there are people that will walk into your office and close the door, or maybe you'll talk to them on the phone. I don't know, but and they will tell you how bad things are at your company, or why it's not a good place to work, or why you should be looking for a job, or why this person's bad or that person's bad. We'll do it at every law firm, we'll do it at every company. And those people, if you have a very high thermostat and a very high expectations for yourself, are essentially trying to knock your thermostat down to their level because they're unhappy. They're not doing a good job. They have problems, but they're going to try to push you back to that level. And I have people like that. There are people out there that are just negative, that they don't support you. They don't support anyone. They just find fault with things and they're unhappy. So they want other people to be unhappy. And you need to avoid that. There's something actually interesting too. And I like this story, and I'm not going to say anything about my personal situation, but there's so many when in the town I'm in, which is Malibu and other places too, I'm sure. But these men, when their wives turn, and this is hard to believe. I can't even believe I'm saying this, but I'm going to just go ahead and do. A lot of times when these men's wives start in their 40s and they've had a couple kids, there's just all these divorces all of a sudden, like just tons of them. And it's actually not just in Malibu. I was thinking it's these people in the valley too, but just tons of them. More than half of these men, all of a sudden, their wives are divorcing them in their mid 40s, or even their wives are in the early 40s. And these are people that, in many cases, I saw this with people that I met when they were much younger, when they were in their 30s, and then knew them for 12, 13 years. And when they were younger, they were very happy. Everyone was excited. They were having kids. And then all of a sudden things get negative in their 40s. And so why is that? And the thing that I noticed is that that I've heard is that I saw one of the most interesting things when I was several years ago. There was one of my neighbors, and my wife at the time was trying to be friends with his wife. And this man was very smart. He started these companies he sold for $100 million each or something. Just a very successful guy, very street smart. And he would always interview his people that wanted to be friends with his wife. And I don't know how he got away with this, but his wife thought it was okay. And then these interviews, the friend being interviewed wouldn't be told it's an interview. He'd always want to meet them. And essentially what he was looking for is he wanted to see if that wife was someone that was negative, that seemed like he wanted to see if she was in a happy marriage and how things looked for her. And he would allow her to be friends with people that seemed like they were in happy marriages, but the ones that weren't, he would always tell her she couldn't be friends with, which again sounds ridiculous. But why was he doing that? He was doing that because he knew that if his wife was associating with other women that had negative opinions of their wives and were all negative, that would come right back on him, and his wife would turn negative and he might get into getting a divorce. And I asked him about this, and he said, I've just seen this happen so many times where women suddenly are associating with other women that are all negative about their husbands, and then they might have previously been happy and positive, and then suddenly they turn negative. Just very interesting to me. And so that happens, and I've seen that happen on my own as well. And one of my friends just got divorced, and he told me that the same thing happened to his wife. And I was like, she's in her early 40s, and all the women started getting divorced at the same time and thinking negatively about their husbands. Now, I'm by no stretch of the imagination saying that these husbands didn't deserve to be divorced or weren't doing anything wrong, because I'm sure they were. But I just thought that was interesting. The people that our spouses often will associate with, the people that will associate with. It's very common for people that drink alcohol to choose and run their social circles around their friends. When I look at dating people, even when you look at profiles on dating sites, people will be like, no teetotalers. Like, the people want to be around people like them. And again, there's nothing wrong with going out and drinking as much as you want, I guess, within limits. But people will associate with people that have certain standards and want to do things a certain way. Athletes will associate with other athletes. People that are wealthy will most often associate with other people that are wealthy. So if you want to become very successful, you need to have high standards. And there's a couple ways in a high thermostat you can do that. One of the first ways, and the easiest way, is to surround yourself with people from school, with other attorneys, with people, whoever you can find in business groups and things, groups for high performing lawyers that have high standards. That's why people go to the best schools they can. They want to have high standards for themselves. It's important to have high standards in certain environments. So you have high standards. Different schools have high standards, but different firms have high standards. So you try to surround yourself with the people with the highest standards. Now, you can't always do that. People can't always be expected to find people right close to them that have very high standards. You just can't. So what do? You just decide that you're going to have high standards for yourself. You have goals. You think of what's possible. What would this look like? What do I really want? And you say, I'm not going to accept anything less than this. I'm not going to accept anything less than spending 500 hours a year trying to develop business. I'm not going to accept anything less than having this level of physical fitness. I'm not going to accept anything less. All these different things you have to set. And if you do set those, then your life and your career are going to change. But then once you get yourself to a higher level, you have to continually reinforce it again and again. And high performance becomes a habit. And that's what it's about. You have to have a high belief in great beliefs in what's possible for you. And this is how people become successful. People do not become successful by accident. Success leaves clues, and those clues are typically people that have high goals for themselves, that continually push themselves, that believe in themselves, that try to seek out people that they can be with that have high goals for themselves, and that creates new levels of what acceptability and what's possible and what you unconsciously may think is okay. And the other thing too is I brought this up when I talked about getting up early and someone that gets up to exercise at 6 a.m. every day and how they won't do that at first and they'll likely do something else and they just won't be pushing themselves the way they could. And so you have to develop a habit of doing something. And anytime you try to do something new, anytime you try to become more successful than you currently are, anytime you're trying to really just make yourself the person you're capable of being, it's going to be uncomfortable. Any change is uncomfortable. Extra hours are uncomfortable. Trying to develop business is uncomfortable. Everything is uncomfortable until it becomes a habit. It's uncomfortable. I used to run and then I started going on a step mill or whatever, but then I hadn't run very much because I had a problem with my ankle for a year. And then I started running again and I decided I was going to run every day. And the first day I ran for 20 minutes and I did that for 2 or 3 weeks. Then I ran for 30 minutes. Then I started running for 45 minutes and then I started running for an hour a day. And that's what I do now. I mean, just 1 hour every day and just develop a habit. And it's not difficult, but it did require, when I started, a lot of discomfort, but you develop a habit. Same thing with anything. You have to develop habits. And so most people out there have set their lives to operate really at a certain level. They accept whatever they're doing as normal. And they have all of these different limits and they believe that they're normal and that's their comfort zone. So what would be an example of having a different type of comfort zone? An example would be, I know a guy that became fairly successful doing personal injury law, but there's different types of success. So one type of success in personal injury law would be doing auto accidents locally and different types of slip and falls and things and considering yourself doing a good job. And you could do a good job doing that. You can make a good living. As a matter of fact, most attorneys in a lot of smaller markets where there's not enough business to do many things, may do trust in states and different things, but most of their income, it's very funny, it usually comes from personal injury things. So it's a good income maker. But you may do personal injury, but some personal injury attorneys will say, hey, I just don't want to do these things. My goal is to do mass torts, whatever, mass injuries from people getting poisoned or whatever, and they'll have those sorts of goals, and then they'll reach those levels, and they'll, instead of making $500,000 a year as a personal injury attorney, they'll set their goal to make 50, and they will. And that's what a lot of people do that become very successful. They set themselves up to operate at a very high level. And you probably have limits yourself as well that you believe are normal, and you don't have as high standards for yourself. What goals do you have for yourself in the next few years? And how many times have you sabotaged whatever type of success you could have based on the way you're operating? And everyone has comfort zones and they regulate those like a body temperature, and in people will change it. And so everyone has internal thermostat. And it could be made higher and better. And are you doing that? And then when the times you have done that, are you staying that? Are you following through? Are you making sure that you're not giving up, that you're don't not re requiring something from yourself? And most people set their thermostat on what they believe they can achieve or deserve to achieve. And this often determines the level of what you can operate at. Sometimes people, I've noticed something too. I'm just going to go out on a little bit of a tangent here for a second, but it's interesting. I noticed that there's people that I've noticed in the past that may have been very successful at one point, and all of a sudden, but when they were successful, they did things like they cheated, they lied, they hurt people, when they didn't have to, they cut corners. And a lot of times those people, even though they're at a certain level of success, they sabotage it and they get caught and they end up at a lower level. Maybe they go to jail. All these bad things happen to them because almost like their internal belief is, I've done something wrong, I'm a bad person, and I can't possibly maintain this level of success. I've seen that a lot. I see a lot of people that have done bad things, whether it's to me or to others. Almost always, they just end up going back to a lower level and they don't stay at this level that they're at. Now, it doesn't happen all the time. And there's certainly a lot of very bad business people, and I say bad like evil, that don't care about people and so forth and do things. But in general, and get away with it, and maybe they're sociopathic, but this happens to a lot of people. You need to start when you improve, you need to stay where you are, and you need to continually set high standards. You need to develop habits for it, and you don't want to ever sabotage yourself and go back where it was before. Like the woman I told you from Harvard Law School, like all these attorneys that drop out of the race and so they can have a lower thermostat. And you don't need to do that. You need to keep making progress, and you need to have discipline. You need to constantly try to raise your thermostat. What is acceptable? And this is what the most successful people do. And they keep doing it and they don't stop. And they often do it as they get older. And they break through these limits. And you can do it no matter what stage of your career you're at. If you're new, you can do it with a higher and higher thermostat. If you're older, you can do it. If you're 20 years out and 30 years out, you can do it because people do it all the time. And I see it all the time. And it's great when I see people succeed. And I want to see you succeed. And you can succeed, but you really need to understand that you need to constantly remind yourself of where you want to be. And one of the most important things you can do, by the way, to imagine where you want to be is just to write out what you want, what you think is acceptable every day. There's this thing called what is it called? It's called let me see what it's called. It's interesting. Oh, it's called the 369 Journal. I'm not selling it, but I just found this interesting. And it has you set a goal, and whatever the goal is, you set it, and then you say what you want. And then each morning you go and you write out what that goal is. And then you write, I don't know, you write it off, write it 3 or 4 times in the morning, and then you write it like 5 or 6 in the afternoon, then you write it 5 or 6 in the evening, and you just keep writing that thing down to set whatever it is you want to achieve. It could be, I'm going to bring in $500,000 in clients this year. And you just write it down and you start setting a kind of a thermostat of being a new person. Very important stuff. So we'll take a quick break. And then when I come back, we'll take questions. And again, this is a live webinar. I will answer any questions anyone has. I'd encourage you to ask questions about your career, anything you think is that you'd like to know the answers to, or any challenges you're facing, or anything related to this webinar I can help with. And I'll be back in just a second. Thanks. All right, give me 1 second. I'll go to questions. Okay, and then just one quick point. A lot of times people worry about their name and stuff being shown when do questions. And I will, before I'll make sure that I take everyone's name off. So I won't answer a thing. People won't see your name. See that? I'm trying to copy this. Give me 1 second. I'm just deleting everyone's name. All right, here we go. Oops. Okay, let me just see your questions. Give me 1 second. Why do attorneys with similar credentials advance at different speeds within the same law firm? So your credentials do not matter once you get into a law firm for the most part. They do matter if they, for the most part, do not matter. So once you're in a law firm, your credentials are really the school you went to, all that sort of stuff. If you're if you're in the same title as everyone, they don't matter. So what matters when you do get into a law firm is essentially the quality of your work, how hard you work, and your interpersonal relationships. And those are all very important. So a lot of times people don't realize that interpersonal relationships are important. You want people to like you. You want how are you thought of and what is your brand with other people? So being interpersonal relationships are a lot more important than people think. It's not just about the quality of work you do, it's how you make the people around you feel. And that's important. Okay, what is the strongest? And if you want to ask a follow-up question, that's good. What helps people advance inside of law firms is how hard they work is actually a major one. It's very important. So hard you work, your hours, and all those sorts of things. But other than that, you have those are some of the most important things, I think, the interpersonal relationships, and but then of course your work, the quality of work you do, and also the amount. And also, here's another one actually that's important. I should have thought about this. The ability to get work and repeat work. So one of the law firms will advance people and evaluate them based on their hours. And so you have to, every time you work in a law firm, whoever the person is that's giving you assignments is a client. And so you want that client to give you more work and to like the quality of your work. So you have to treat, if a partner is giving you work, you treat them like a client. You're nice to them. You make them feel good about themselves. You treat them the same way the attorney would treat one of their clients, and it's important. And so that you think about things that way. Okay, what is the best legal practice area for long-term job security and strong exit opportunities? So you have to decide in any practice area who you want to work for. Who who do you want to work for? Do you want to work for? So you have to, this is a decision you make. So you either work for yourself or a law firm or the government or otherwise, right? So you decide who you want to work for. So if you want to work for yourself, then there are some practice areas, if you want to do that in the long run, that are exceptional, where you can make a lot of money. You can work in family law or trust and estates, family law, trust and estates, sorry, trust and estates, personal injury. There's a bunch of them. These are just some to look at. So you can work in practice areas like that. So you can always Most attorneys that go into these practice areas are always employable or can work for themselves. If you want to work for a law firm, you have to decide what that is. The most popular practice area is anything to do with litigation. So that tends to have a lot of, you can all 50, more than 50% of jobs are litigation. So practice area is litigation. But then there's other practice areas that like corporate and real estate, where there's always going to be opportunities and if you get good at that in companies, and to a lesser extent, as you get more senior, to a lesser extent senior in law firms, senior. So that's a way to think about it in terms of employment stability. So you either work for yourself, which is for many people, it's a good decision, or if you want to work in a law firm, most of the most marketable practice areas there tends to be the need for more litigators than other practice areas. And then things like corporate and real estate are also very good. There's others, for example, like patent prosecution that can be okay, but you have to be very careful with your practice areas because when you are choosing what type of practice area you want to be in, one of the simplest things you can do is just go online and search for jobs and see where most of the jobs are. And if you search for certain practice areas like employee benefits, for example, or trademark law, you may not find many jobs. So if there's not many jobs, it's going to make it more difficult for you to get a position. There often is a lot of stability in different types of government positions, so you could also look at that as well. So you could look at what government jobs are. Government jobs, people typically will be able to have much longer term careers with better hours and more stability, but less pay than you might in other types of practice settings. Okay, what are entry level jobs for law graduates who didn't clerk or go to big law? So you can still work in smaller law firms. There's 100,000 plus law firms, more than that. Sorry, probably like 500, hundreds of thousands. And then there's solo practitioners. There's all these different types of people that anybody can get a job with, and it's not that hard. The idea of people being unemployed to me is just sometimes crazy because there's just so many different types of employers. And then there's the government. The list of employers an attorney can work for is just massive. There's so many different places anyone can work if you want to find a job that you should never worry too much about it. There's just a ton of opportunity. It's just you don't in law firms alone. The mistake that people make is they only look at jobs that are on job sites. They don't apply to more than one type of firm or job. They will apply to firms that have in only large cities. They'll only apply to large firms. So if you're looking for a job, you should be looking at as many markets as you can in your state and cities where there's bar reciprocity in all these different places, because that's really the most effective way to find a position is to look as many places as possible. And yeah, thank you for this comment. You're speaking the truth. Thank you for being transparent because people need to hear this and understand the facts. Keeping the opportunities just as important. Thank you. Let's see here. Next one. How can our law firm measure whether attorneys are truly raising their standards in areas like client service, business development, and accountability? So a lot of times how a client feels about the candidate, but the attorney, the client will make the people know that is giving them the work, that associates working for a partner, the client will say things. Business development should be pretty straightforward with the amount of business that the attorney brings in. It shows if they are doing a good job and then raising their standards with that. And then in terms of accountability, the hours that the person works and our reports all reference that as well. That's important. How do I negotiate a relocation package, signing bonus and guarantee bonus when accepting a law firm job offer? Typically, you have to be very careful with all this stuff. If a law firm is relocating you, then there's a couple things you can do. But a signing bonus and a guaranteed bonus, most law firms do not offer signing bonuses. I would say more than 90% of them. So if you ask for a signing bonus, you're probably not going to get one. And you might also piss off the firm. So you have to be careful of that. And the same thing with a guaranteed bonus. Most law firms will not guarantee bonuses because they're dependent on how the law firm does financially. So asking for a guaranteed bonus is also probably not the best idea. So if it was me, I wouldn't ask for that. Now, relocation is one thing. I actually think it's perfectly acceptable to ask about that. So sometimes you can ask the firm if they will pay, if they will offer you some sort of relocation expense, if they will help with relocation, which would be moving and that sort of thing. And the majority of law firms, meaning probably at least 70% of them will. And so I think it's okay to ask about that. But I don't think asking about a signing bonus and guarantee bonus is in your best interest. I'll tell you a couple things that I've seen happen. I saw it happen last year several times, and it can really kill deals. I've seen people try to ask for more money and meaning a higher salary sometimes. And I saw last year two people get offers, and then when they asked for more money, the law firm basically said no, and then they pulled the offer, saying if you're not happy with what we're offering, you're not going to be happy here. So I've seen people do that. I've seen that happen. I saw that happen twice last year. And then I saw someone else try to ask for clarification about what they would need to get a certain type of bonus. And then the law firm did the same thing. They pulled the offer. I don't know why this is happening. I didn't see it in previous years, and now I'm seeing it this year, or I saw it last year. And so I think law firms may be taking their power back. I mean, the pandemic and things, they didn't, but now I think there's something going on with that. And I think you need to be very careful with any employer whenever you're doing that. Okay. How do I research a law firm's culture and associate retention rate before accepting a job offer? So you can research it. Typically, you're going to get a sense of what the culture is when you're interviewing there, and you'll see, are you comfortable with the people you're interviewing with? And if you're comfortable there with the people you're interviewing with, then that's a sign that you may like the culture. If you are uncomfortable with the people you're interviewing with or the people that you're talking to, then that's a sign that you may actually be if you're comfortable, that's a sign that you would be comfortable. You can't go out and necessarily research a firm's culture or research your associate retention rate because everything is dependent upon you and the firm. So if you click with the people there, and they hire people that don't click, well, then those people just are not for that are not the right people for that culture. Certain law firms are retaining people. They retain people that do good work. They retain people that get along with people there. They retain people. It's just completely different. I've told this story a bunch, but I've hired people before, and two of my first hires at BCG, one had been at a previous firm for 16 years, and the other had been at a previous firm for 8 years. 16 years later, the one that had been at the one that had been at a previous firm 16 years, stayed with me 18 years. The one that had been at a previous firm 8 years, stayed with me like 11 years. But during that time, I probably hired 50 people that came and went, same position. And certain people stick around, do well in different cultures than others. And certain people get along in any type of culture than others. It depends on the individual. So I don't think you can certainly go and read about the firm's culture, but typically people that are saying negative things about the firm are the ones that aren't doing a good job there, and then they get fired or whatever. I think you research it based on how you feel with the people. Do the people make you comfortable or not? And people have a very good sense of the type of people they're likely to do well with. Okay, what does it really mean to raise your standards as a law student who wants to become a successful attorney? It means to have standards. Standards could be the grades you get. Standards could be the type of job you want to get. Standards could be how aggressive you are in your job search. Standards should be what practice area you want to be in. You can have standards for anything. So anybody that can have standards. Now, anybody that wants to succeed at anything can, if you don't have goals, then you're going to be part of someone else's goals. It's as simple as that. So you want to have goals, and you want to make sure that you have goals that are pushing you in a certain direction in your career as opposed to the other way. The more you have goals and the more standards you have, the better. You can raise your standards by surrounding yourself with law students that are getting jobs in the best firms. You can raise your standards about reading about successful attorneys and reading what they did. All these things will help you raise standards. And that would be my recommendation for that. Give me one second. Okay, what are the most the top legal talent, the competitive legal hiring market? What are the most effective ways for a law firm to attract and retain top legal talent in a competitive hiring market? The most effective way is to pay a lot of money. So that's the more money you pay, the more applicants you will get. Okay. It's as simple as that. I hate to say that. You pay, the more talent you get. And then also to tell people that there's a path to partnership, the hours are low, all those sorts of things, but you're going to get the best people based on how much money you pay. And that's why everybody seems to want it. Most people, not all, want to work at the very top law firms. How do I prevent legal recruiters from submitting my resume to law firms without my permission? BCG, what happens, the way we make sure that doesn't happen is we will go in and our candidates need to actually they have accounts, and so they need to log in to their accounts and approve them. Most recruiting firms do not have accounts where people have to log in and do, I don't think any of them do actually, but we have everything as an online systems. So how do you prevent people from doing that without your permission? Typically, you would have them make sure that they send you a list of places or the place or whatever that you want them to that they have that think you'd be a good fit for. They want to submit you to, and then they get that list. You need to respond to the email and say that that's okay for those firms. It's as simple as that. So that's how you do that. Okay, next question. How do I choose the right practice area? Oh, I think I answered that one. Okay, let's see. Jump into a meeting. Thank you for this presentation. Beyond excited, highly motivated. Cheers. Okay, I'm an incoming 1L at USC Google. What are some tips on big law recruitment getting a summer offer from a Vault 20? So the most important thing for law firms to get a job for law students is going to be your grades. So law firms now do recruit first year associates to work there, but the better grades you get, the better. So the most important thing you can do is really give everything you have to getting the best grades, especially your first semester, because that's really what's going to determine everything. The other thing I'll just say, and I hate to say this, USC is a good school, but if you get really good grades there, like awesome grades, then you could even transfer to Harvard or whatever, Columbia or NYU or something. So that's what a lot of people will do too, because then that will also help them get into larger firms. LA is a huge market, so there's a lot of opportunity. But at the same time, if you can get really good grades and get into a better school as well, that can help you. Or just the good grades. People at the top of their class from USC get the best jobs, but it's just you have to get the best grades. And you can't really worry about the firm you're at. All these firms, these V20s or Vault 20s or whatever, only are available if you get the best grades. That's how they hire. There's no other way for a law firm to distinguish between different attorneys at different law schools other than the ranking and quality of the law school, or in addition to that, in addition to the rank and quality of the law school or your grades at the law school. So the best grades at the best law school you can will determine where you do end up. So for observing terms with high standards, what are the habits that are non-negotiable? Committing to the profession, committing to a practice setting, meaning a law firm can be very important, committing to hours, committing to business development, all those sorts of things. If you want to do that and you want to be successful, you need to commit the hours, the doing the best work you can, meaning the best quality work, all those things are important for that. You have to decide what you want. So, but I would say business development, I would say quality of the work, I would say hours, I would say a commitment to an employer, et cetera. These are some of the most important things that I think that the people should be doing. Okay, what advice do you have a non-traditional law student in his 40s while working full time? So you can go to law school in your 40s and still get a job in a major US law firm if you do well there at night or however you're doing it. In most cases, one of the things to keep in mind is regardless of what practice area you go into, it takes about 5 years to learn and become proficient in a practice area. So if you graduate at the age of 45, you're going to be 50 before you know what you're doing, which is okay. There's nothing there's nothing wrong with not knowing what you're doing. But at the age of to start at the age of 50, because attorneys practice into their 80s. You still have a 30-year career ahead of you if you start when you're 50. But my advice to you would be if you're working full time, don't get too dependent on the amount of money you're making at your employer because you're going to have to start, if you want to work in a law firm, you're going to have to probably take some sort of pay cut, or you can use I mean, you may not, or you can use your new job to, or you can use your law degree to start your own practice, which a lot of people do. A law degree, which people don't often realize, is essentially a license to charge people money to provide legal services. And that's what it used to be. People didn't used to go to work in law firms. They used to go set up their own law firm in whatever city, solo practice in whatever city they were from. So that's how it's worked traditionally. Let me just see any more questions. Let's see. Okay, sorry, I'm just looking at some question then. Okay, how do I explain my high standards and boundaries to family and friends? I don't want to come off as a snob and that they feel left out. Typically, if you tell your family and friends about your high standards, then they're gonna tell you why you shouldn't have those high standards often. Or they may say good for you, but not really mean it. Because anytime you're telling people that you think you want to be better than them, then it's not in their, that's just not how people don't often react like that. So you can certainly tell your parents if your parents are going to be proud of you, and you can tell your friends if you think they're going to be proud of you. But most of the time when people change their standards, they change their friends. So people that used to drink a lot, for example, don't suddenly stop drinking and spend time with the same friends going out drinking all the time. They develop different standards, and that's just how it works. And people that started off in a small law firm and then move to a major one often do not stay around the people from the smaller law. So you don't have to explain things to family and friends. You just need to make sure that you're keeping your, you may oftentimes keep things to yourself, because if you don't keep things to yourself, then you can end up around people that are sabotaging. There's no reason to always share that kind of information. Okay, answer live. What skills do I need to make $5 to $10 million a year without being a big law partner? The people that make that much money are typically doing things related to torts and suing people. So that would be, you would need to learn how to become very good at running some sort of firm or where you're suing companies and on behalf of people, or suing governments and that sort of thing. So that's typically how people will do that. Or you can start your own law firm. It could be and doing all sorts of different things, and whatever that law firm does, you can make that much money potentially. Anybody that's your goal is to make that much money, you typically will figure it out. And so you can, but regardless of whatever you're doing, the most important thing to be able to make that kind of money is your ability to recruit people to work for you and to recruit clients and to find some sort of niche in the market. And if you can do that, you can make that kind of money. I'm surprised all the time when I meet people that have managed to make that much money, because you never would have expected it. And they're able to do it because they do things right. But to try to make that much money, you have to have those sorts of goals. And once I remember I was working in a law firm and I set a goal to make a certain amount of money, which seemed completely unattainable 5 years from then. And I kept reminding myself of that, and then I did. So you can definitely do it. Okay, thank you for this webinar. This person's name shown, so I'm not going to say. I'm pivoting into law in my late 30s from a non-traditional background in bioengineering, R&D, and product management. And I'm now in law school. I'm interested in litigation, specifically patent litigation in the medical device or product liability. Do you have advice for someone with a hybrid technical and business background who is breaking into litigation as a career changer? So it's great if you have a technical background. So what people do with technical backgrounds often is, and what I would recommend doing, is taking the patent bar. So the patent bar is an exam that you can only take if you have a scientific type of background, or computer science and math and physics and things like that. So I would recommend taking that. Once you pass that exam, you can become a very attractive candidate for firms doing any form of IP litigation. Now, IP litigation positions are not always easy to get because you can do two types of them. You can do them as a plaintiff or you can do them as a defendant. Both are useful, but to work in a decent sized firm, a large firm you would be doing mostly defense, but some of them would do plaintiffs. You'd be doing mostly defense. So you have to, excuse me, just grabbing something here. Yeah, so you would have to decide for yourself which one you want to do. The other question or the other thing you brought up, let me just see. Okay. The other thing you brought up that I wanted to touch on real briefly too is doing product liability. Product liability jobs are easier to get. They're easier to get doing a defense, and they're also easier to get doing plaintiff's work. So plaintiff would be the easiest, and then defense. Anybody can go into either of those. You should be able to get jobs in any form of product liability, and then anything to do with IP litigation can be a little bit more difficult just because they're larger firms, but you can still get them if you search enough. You can find them as plaintiffs or work or defense. IP litigation isn't as active as it used to be, but most firms that do IP litigation, especially on the defense side, like people that have experience doing plaintiffs or have experience working in law firms. I'm not working in law firms, but have the patent bar. That's just looks very good to clients. And then, of course, final thing you can do if you don't want to be a patent, if you want to do patent related work, would be to work as a patent prosecutor. So you can learn how to do that and once you pass the patent bar, you can do that. Okay, thanks everyone for all the great questions and for being here. I hope this webinar helped you today. And I like this particular topic. I'm going to do one like this next week as well to hopefully, I like it when I'm able to inspire people with this kind of information. And I hope you're inspired too, and you can do much better in your career and life after today. Thank you. And see here.